We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which all our Catholic school communities stand. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations peoples joining us today. A prayer for teachers on World Teachers' Day. Loving God, we thank you for the many gifts our teachers bring to our school communities. We ask your blessing on every teacher and thank you for the ways in which they listen and guide. Refresh and renew the spirits of our teachers who give so generously. Provide strength and wisdom as they work patiently with young people and their families as witness to your love. May they continue to inspire. We thank you especially for that teacher who has been a role model in our own lives. We pray these things in the name of our great teacher, Jesus. Amen.
Welcome to our 2023 Australian Catholic Education Symposium. We have hundreds of staff, leaders, parents and others involved in Catholic education and beyond joining us from across the country. I'd like to take this opportunity to affirm our teachers and leaders as we celebrate World Teachers' Day this Friday. This year, the international theme is the teachers we need for the education we want. There is a significant focus on responding to the teacher workforce challenges that we see across all sectors of education, and most felt in our regional, rural and remote areas. It's not just about attracting more teachers to the profession, but also about how we provide the best initial teacher education, ongoing development and mentoring, and supporting teachers throughout their careers. It's also about how we continue to lift the status of the teaching profession in our communities across Australia. In our Catholic schools, the vocation of teaching reflects the desire to bring our young people closer to God and their faith, and to bring expression to the words of Jesus in John, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." In hosting this symposium today, we recognise the important task of our teachers to know each and every child and to guide them in their learning and formation so they can flourish and have life to the full. In the recent Vatican instruction, Identity of the Catholic School for a Culture of Dialogue, the Congregation of Catholic Education reminds us that students are active participants in the education process, and as they mature, they become the protagonists of their own education. So it is incumbent on us to listen to young people within the context they live and learn, and to support them to achieve an integration of faith and culture. This starts with the recognition that each child is made in the image and likeness of God. For our keynote speaker today, listening to and gaining a deeper understanding of children and young people has been a key focus of her life's work. Professor Anne Graham is Professor of Childhood Studies and Founding Director of the Centre for Children and Young People at Southern Cross University. A primary teacher by background, Anne has worked in education for 20 years. Anne has led over 70 research projects, including 8 Australian Research Council funded studies, most of which focus on children's wellbeing, participation and safety. While Anne collaborates closely with Catholic and state education systems, she also leads projects involving other major state and Commonwealth government departments, key statutory bodies, major national and international non-government organisations, and many regionally based organisations providing programs and services to children. Anne's research, which emphasises the critical importance of hearing children's views, has been recognised by numerous awards, including an Officer of the Order of Australia for her contribution to higher education in the area of children's studies and children's research. I'm delighted today to welcome Professor Anne Graham to present our keynote, Are We Listening? How can Catholic schools respond to student views for wellbeing, faith formation and learning? And following this, a panel discussion moderated by Dr Debra Sayce, the Executive Director of Catholic Education Western Australia. Thank you to everyone for joining us.
Very much for that introduction, and thank you Kelly, also for your acknowledgement of country and prayer. It's really lovely to be with you all. I'm joining you today from the beautiful Bundjalung country on the north coast of New South Wales, and I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I remain ever mindful that this land on which I live and breathe and have my being was and always will be Aboriginal land. Our brief time together today is really an opportunity to reflect on what each of you bring to your work as educators, day in, day out, that potentially changes children's lives. In their work on leadership, and each of you, whether you're a classroom teacher, whether you work for the system at system level, whether you work at a diocesan level, whether you're a parent, whether you're clergy, we're all leaders in the spaces that we occupy in education. And Heifetz and Linsky say there are times as leaders when we've just got to get off the dance floor. We really need to go up to the balcony so that we can get a bit more of an expansive view of what's happening down below. So I've popped in a few questions that some of you may have seen before to guide this kind of conversation today, really. So the questions that I think we're asking from the balcony today of the dance floor are, who is the child or young person that's on the dance floor? What do we most deeply desire for them? What is our enduring legacy in Catholic education? Is this life-giving? Or in any form of education, but in Catholic education specifically today, what's happening that builds it, what's happening that doesn't lead to this. So really it's about not so much what we do, but why we do what we do. We get some beautiful direction, I think, in the Alice Springs Declaration, because it sets out our vision in this country for what we want for every young Australian, to be the best they can be, no matter where they live or what kind of learning challenges they face. In essence, this declaration signals for us, I think, the critical importance of a lot of what we're talking about today. It's about participation, inclusion, safety, well-being and ethical practice in building this kind of a student-centred system. So in some respects today, also from the balcony, I guess we're kind of interrogating for ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about student-centred practice? What does it look like in Catholic education? Well, whenever I work with a school or a diocese or a school system of any kind, I go to their websites and I have a little look and say, what's the narrative that they're putting around the work that they do in Catholic education? So I had a little bit of a peek at what different dioceses and archdioceses here, some of which, you know, I know well and some of which I don't. So this is a little bit random, but I think it makes the point well, that what we're looking at are a whole lot of statements about how we bring life to the work that we do, that sit as central to our mission. So lots and lots of words always that we're looking at there. But when I look at those, and it's really interesting that Jacinta has also referred to this, what I see most often in those, either implicitly or explicitly, comes back really to about 4 words, and it's these: life, full stop; abundantly, full stop, for all. So those narratives about vision and about mission and about purpose, and to some extent in strategy documents, really reflect that beautiful scripture that Jacinta flagged about, I came so that they may have life and have it more abundantly. Because in that scripture passage, we've really got that mission that guides us as we accompany our students on that journey towards fullness of life. In our schools, though, we often articulate that mission through these kind of 3 domains. Sometimes we call them different things, but essentially what we're talking about is well-being. How do we walk and talk it? we've got a domain around wellbeing. How do we support wellbeing? How do we enrich learning? And how do we nourish faith lives? So it is about wellbeing and the human condition, frail as it is from time to time. Contemporary pedagogies, how are we continuing to refine the ways that we engage with children and young people in their learning, and in our faith tradition, in a Catholic Christian Catholic Christian faith lens. So what works, what doesn't, what could, is what we're often asking in those spaces. But I guess what where my work has taken me is to thinking about what's the overlap? What are the practices that we engage in one or more of those spheres that possibly has implications for what we're trying to achieve in those other spheres? And I think what it's also I'm noticing in a lot of the schools and systems I'm working with is where we're starting to say, especially in secondary schools, we no longer think of teaching and learning is where it's at, and those lovely people over there do wellbeing, and the people who are a little bit holier than the rest of us might do the faith work. That's all gone. We don't think about it in those terms anymore, because we're coming back to claim and reclaim again that actually the faith, the wellbeing, and the learning of children and young people are all of our business. First things first. So this question about who is the child or young person that we engage with at school? Are they good, bad, innocent, dangerous, delinquent, vulnerable, resistant, passive, capable, malleable human beings or becomings, a project to be worked on, or, as Jacinta reminded us, as well made in the image and likeness of God? What's really I think a bit of a giveaway I often talk about in schools, it's not just how we speak to a child, it's how we speak about them that I think we often have to pay attention to as well. And I think what's really interesting about this idea that childhood is kind of mediated by our beliefs a little bit about children and about their human dignity, their voice, agency and status is that it really inverts some taken for granted assumptions about children that we've held for quite a long time. Children aren't necessarily seen to have authority. They rarely hold legitimate power. They don't vote. They often come to our attention through their deficits rather than their strengths. Their vulnerability often stands out more than their capability. And sometimes they are thought about in terms of sort of better being seen and not heard. They're all old assumptions that we've sort of held, and some have persisted for a very long time. As someone who's been working in this area for a long time, one of the questions that I was most frequently asked when I started out this work in particularly in doing research that directly involved children and young people, sometimes on sensitive topics, the question I often got was, why do you need to involve children and young people? And I'd say, well, because they know a fair bit of stuff about their lives that we might not know. And very often, when I probed a little bit more deeply, they'd say, well, children don't tell you the truth. And as I often say, well, adults don't either sometimes. So we're really, we're sort of, again, it's a little bit of a giveaway in terms of the constructions we hold of children. The reason why I think this is important is because how we see children and young people changes everything. How we see children and young people changes everything. When I've worked in teacher education for a very long time, and first lecture, first year, I asked two questions. One is, why did you become a teacher? And the second question I would always ask is, do you like children? And often they'd look at me, as if I was sort of a bit strange. But I wanted to make the point, if you're setting out on this journey, start with first principles. How do we see these children? How are we prepared to work with them? The reason why, as I say, the reason why it's important is because it influences how we interact with them and they with us, what we expect of them and they with us, whether we trust them and they trust us, or how they see themselves and they see us. So there's big implications in that, in walking and talking what we mean by student-centred schools. First principles, how do we see the children and young people we work with, because it influences us so much. Pope Francis had this to say: why engage their views? The temptation to silence young people has always existed. There are many ways to silence young people and make them invisible, many ways to anaesthetise them, to keep them quiet, ask nothing, question nothing. There are many ways to sedate them, to keep them from getting involved, to make their dreams flat, dreary, petty, and plaintive. So I don't think that Pope Francis was holding back really in the call that he was really making to us to say, are we listening? Are we paying attention to what our young people might be trying to tell us, because life has changed. A few years ago, I happened to come across a Jesuit priest when I was working in the United States, and he'd been a principal for about 40 years. And he said, I always ask myself two things when the students come through the gate on the first day of term. I ask myself the question, will I know each of these students by name by the end of this term? The second thing he would say is to remind himself and others in the school to view their students as mystery. So at that point, he had me captivated, and he used this analogy of an iceberg to explain what he meant by this. He said that every student we serve has parts of themselves that we meet, recognise, and we get to know, sometimes quite quickly and sometimes for the wrong reasons. This is just the tip of the iceberg. That's the bit that we see every day. We meet it. But then he said, we need to be reminded there are also parts of them that are yet to be named, known, and called into being. And that we must trust that by showing our love, respect, and unconditional regard, that each student will come to know themselves better from having been in our care. So I guess what some of those questions are that arise from that sit underneath the surface. These are not the things that we'll hear students say, and yet these are things that what they do tell us often point to. So he said, talking about seeing the child as mystery, asking this question, in what ways do we acknowledge or reverence these deeper questions that are yet to be named, known, and called into being? Do we know their worlds? Because that's one of the things, I guess, as teachers, we learn very early on, is that we can't look in the rear vision to work out what it is that our young people know and what they need. We know that their contemporary childhood is characterised by and shaped by globalisation, by rapid social and environmental change and uncertainty, lives lived as much online as offline, childhood being supervised and institutionalised, pluralism, super diversity of culture, religion, gender, and sexuality. So none of that would be a surprise to any of us in the big room today. We know that they are influences that have fundamentally changed and continue to change the current generation in our schools. And there's a big literature on all of that. What are their big concerns? What are the concerns out there for them? The first is the environment, prominent concerns around equity and discrimination, and they have increased markedly since the previous survey to this one a year or so before. And the third one, of course, is mental health, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So what we think we're hearing here is that this is a generation that has been part of and knows and been witness to things like Black Lives Do Matter, like the Me Too movement, like the environmental movement, wars being fought a long way away from us that continue to shape their childhoods. So Their key personal concerns, many of these again probably won't be much of a surprise for you, but challenges at school, academic pressure, high workload, challenges with teachers, learning difficulties, general school challenges. By far and away is the key personal concern. Mental health challenges, again, low mental health, high stress, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and then relationship changes, the death of somebody close to them, experiences of abuse, challenging relationship families. So it's this context that prompts us to ask that question again, what is it that we really desire for our students? If this is their lives and this is what they're navigating, then what do we really desire for them? And do we need to look even more closely at all of the things that are happening in our schools already that may be supporting these? Is their faith a strength? Well, doesn't matter what data you look at. We know we're living in a liminal time with lots and lots of change, but we don't have time to kind of look closely at these, and there's no need to. But again, I think it's just paying attention to the ways in which they're describing their meaning-making systems. If they've got big questions that sit below the surface, how do they make meaning from those? Because that's a really important part of their education, obviously, but it's a really important part of well-being and any kind of notion of a journey towards fullness of life. What does it mean? What does all this mean for well-being? So well-being, for those of us who've been around for a while, 20 odd years ago, well-being started to become a little bit of a hurrah word because we were all using it. We rarely defined it. We possibly had different assumptions and expectations about how it might be best supported in schools. And the go-to view with that is often counsellors and interventions and programs, all of which play a really important role in school. But that seems to me to be just a part of it. Doesn't matter what definition we're working out of in terms of well-being, but I just kind of put this one up as a sample of it's a secular education system in Canada. Well-being is a positive sense of self, spirit, and belonging that we feel when our cognitive, emotional, social, and physical needs are being met. It is supported through equity and respect for our diverse identities and strengths. So it's that sort of expansion, if you like, of the ways in which we're defining well-being to capture that contemporary kind of life that our young people are really living now. I do quite a bit of work for UNICEF's Office of Research in Achenti, and they have a beautiful one around younger children about, what makes me, and they talk about core capabilities for living and learning. And in that model, we can kind of see where the spiritual sits. Yes, we've got the mental, emotional, physical. We've got that unique potential, which might otherwise be called the mystery, that which is not yet for some of these children and young people. But it's a much more all-encompassing approach to understanding well-being. So I just wanted to focus a little bit now. That backdrop is really important, I think, because if we're otherwise thinking about well-being, the young people we're working with are kind of not objects that we're working on. We're really kind of thinking about what's their day-to-day life. Who is this child? Who is this young person? How do I see them? What are they navigating? And then how are we setting up what we do in schools to be able to support that? So our research in this space started a good while back. And today I'm just going to really, really quickly skim over the top of 3 big studies that we did that might be of interest to you in thinking about this relationship between well-being and learning and nourishing faith lives. So 3 big studies, all ARC studies. The first one was focused on improving approaches to wellbeing in schools. So one of the things we knew was that a lot of the definitions of wellbeing we were working out of were coming from adults, not from young people. So we wanted to undertake a big study that sought to look at this. We were looking at this issue of recognition, which I'll come back to in a moment, but we wanted to know what role recognition played as a predictor of well-being. So this study explored that. Second study I'll talk about is then one that led on from this, which was saying one of the things that came out from that first study is young people, particularly in the high school. So that was a big study. We had the qualitative work was 6 to 18-year-olds. The quantitative work was 8 to 17-year-olds that were involved in that study. But the older cohort was talking about the importance of having a voice. So we wanted to know which elements of participation at school also contribute to well-being. And then the third one I'll just very briefly touch on today came on the back of the Royal Commission into Child Institutional Sexual Abuse, where there were just some abiding concerns as we all stepped up to the mark to adopt national child safe standards and principles and looked at policies and all those things to keep young people safe. One of the things that we wondered a lot about was would we perhaps comply with all of that, but not still be creating cultures in our schools where young people, or in our organisations where young people thrive. So why recognition? Recognition is the act of acknowledging others and coming to be acknowledged by others. So recognition is a term that we're clearly in this country it's much closer to home for us now than when we started this work. And there's two forms of recognition. One is around recognition that comes through relationships, and that's primarily where our work has gone. The other is the recognition that comes through political institutions and social institutions and other institutions. And we often think about that as vertical recognition, and this other is horizontal recognition. But why this is important in terms of human interaction is that we define and construct ourselves in relation to the other. So recognition holds that I only come to know who I am and what I can do through the relationships that offer me a way of being able to work that out. Recognition, and Bingham was one of the first to do work on recognition in schools, but there's been a little bit more done, including by ourselves in this time. Recognition is also understood as a dynamic process where an individual, think about a child or a young person, comes to experience themselves as having a certain status. So think about all of those students that sit in our classrooms that think they don't have a voice. They don't really feel that's something that is theirs to have at school. So again, it's thinking about how we recognise those. And we're not talking about recognition in terms of an award that we give at assembly. We're looking at something much more fundamental than that. We're looking at the ways in which our relationships work to allow us to look at how we see ourselves. Taylor talks about recognition not being a courtesy. It's not an add-on. It's a vital human need and central to why we exist, and links to the fundamental importance of relationships. The work I've drawn on is a German philosopher, and I always say in talks I give, he's not light reading, but actually some of the work has really seeded some tremendous possibilities, I think, out of this work. He talks about 3 modes of recognition in order for us to be able to form well in terms of our identity. He says we need love, we need attention around that, we need rights and solidarity. So relationships in which that sense of self develops. Obviously, a child's most closest relationships, intimate relationships of family, are critically important, but they tell us so are those relationships at school. Rights and about having mutual respect and the experience of that, and solidarity, feeling like you belong. and that there's something that you share with others. And he talks especially about this concept that I think is really important, and schools that I work with pick it up quite a bit, is about the other of recognition, and that's misrecognition. He says that recognition is always characterised by struggles, particularly because social justice and the way that works is often about a bit of a struggle. And we need to be on the lookout for instances of misrecognition. We translated this in that first big study that we did for schools. So we asked a lot of students in schools about this concept of love and what that looked like. And they articulated in terms of being cared for, how we're there for each other, how we care for each other, we know and trust someone enough to ask for help. Honeth talks about how central it is to experience that for my self-confidence, for our self-confidence as we develop, so that we get a sense of I am okay or I am loved, whatever that context might be. The second mode of recognition is about rights and being respected. Young people in schools said being respected is about the way we treat each other. For example, it means that we should respect each other's rights to be listened to and treated fairly. And again, Honeth talks about this, reference to self with all of that, but he says that that's critically important in developing self-respect. And solidarity, students talk about being valued as part of, about our contributions being noticed by people important to us. When we are valued, we feel encouraged to work together to make things better. And that's really important for our self-esteem. There's a whole lot of things out there I can't influence, but if you're working with me to help me work out what I can influence, for example, in a group learning situation, that's really important. So just to turn really briefly to what we did, I should have mentioned, because there may be people from these dioceses, this was a piece of work we were able to do because we worked with the Catholic Diocese of Lismore, Townsville and the Archdiocese of Melbourne were all involved in this study. It was a big study. We had over 9,000 students in the sample and we bit off more than we could chew, I know, with a sample that size. We also did an enormous lot of qualitative work in schools with over 600 interviews with students and more with staff. But we got a really rich picture. And with all of these that I'm just zooming over the top of from now till the end of this presentation, I'll just give you the link at the end where you can come in and have a look at the richness of some of the data of what kids have told us. But some of the headlines were these. They told us that well-being was understood in terms of being, having and doing. And so we knew that somehow recognition had an important role to play. Relationships were critically important. We asked a specific question in the qualitative work: when things get tough at school, what do you need? What do we need to change? And they said, I just need, very often, in this respect, someone who knows me and likes me. They talked about the little things being the big things. And this is what I'd want everybody here today to really be present to. There are so many everyday routine things that are happening in schools that young people told us about that make a tremendous positive difference in their life, just being noticed. So we knew that when we introduced the concept of recognition into schools, and we were using those definitions of being cared for, being respected and being valued, what teachers said to us, even though this was about student well-being, is what about us? We can't give what we don't have. And so it drew our attention a little bit more to what recognition looks like and feels like for teachers in our school systems, and asking them what they needed to experience those same, have those same experiences. And in that study, we found recognition was strongly positively associated with well-being. The jury was not out. We probably could have done with 200 students, not 9,000, but nevertheless, that's what we got. Terrific data on that. I want to turn just quickly to the second study, which was then around the issue of participation in schools. What about those students who said we had a bit of literature around to suggest that participation, usually used, the proxy for participation is this idea of voice, having a voice in schools. So often it's through an SRC or something like that. But what these students were talking about was really something different. They were saying, when it comes to questions about their meaning making, their religion, as they'd call it, or their faith or their spirituality, they weren't sure that their questions were always welcome. They wanted to be able to engage in safe spaces where they could wonder about some of these things. They wanted to have a say in, a little bit more of a say in the way things were done. So we set about looking at, because we were just particularly interested in the elements of participation that contribute to well-being. This is what we found. 4 elements: having voice, having influence, having choice, and working together were all important. I won't go through all of these because we don't have time today, but what was really interesting about these were the different places in spaces in which they were happening in schools. So again, thinking about having voice, having influence, having choice and working together, underpinned by relationships and recognition, because every encounter that they had, that they were talking to us about, was characterised by, I feel safe to talk here, I'm able to talk here, I feel cared about, I feel respected. So that kind of what we've got underneath there on that visual about relationships and recognition is what holds all of that up. If you put the structures on top, they're on weak foundations. We've got to pay close attention to those relationships. So very quickly, what makes this study noteworthy is that there were those 4 elements that predicted well-being. These were not significant in and of themselves. Voice about schooling and voice about activities. Voice about schooling, students say we fill out surveys, but nobody ever comes back to tell us what we found, or how we solve what we found about that. Voice about activities, some students felt that was a little bit tokenistic. I think those might be significant for other things, but they were not statistically significant in terms of well-being. Very quickly, why does it impact? So when we looked at the statistical pathway between participation, recognition, and well-being, it looks like this. Students who experience more opportunities for meaningful participation also received more recognition from others, and they gave more recognition to others. Students who experienced more recognition also reported greater well-being, and there was a direct link also between a strong association between participation and well-being. So what was it saying to us? It said, again, it's not just about well-being that we're focusing on, it's about the approaches to well-being, and are they building cultures within our classrooms, our playgrounds, our schools, where young people feel cared about, valued and respected. And I've just shot a few questions up there because they're the ones that I worked with the Department of Education in New South Wales and the Lismore Diocese and the New South Wales Children's Commission on this particular project. But at the end of it, I raised questions like this. Who was in the room? Which children and young people? Who's missing, underrepresented, too hard to reach? Who was silent, less heard, less skilled, inclined or practiced at expressing their views? How do we support them? And do we listen as adults? Does anything change, or is that participation just performative, another thing that we do, but not necessarily understanding its potential? Just very quickly in relation to ethical practice and enablers of ethical practice. So we wanted to know about, yes, it might be safe, but is it ethical? And when we asked about ethical practice in schools, young people said, oh, it's kind of like when it's the right and the righter thing to do in schools. Very eloquent, but, you know, when it's, that's how they defined it. So some things are right to do. So it's that difference between what we have to do and what we ought to do to support young people. So these were the enablers of ethical practice as they saw it in schools, both students and staff. This is combined relationships, organisational culture and leadership, values and attitudes, reflexivity, the capacity to go to the balcony a bit, you know, and have a look at what's happening on the dance floor and reflect on it, organisational compliance, equality, fairness, inclusiveness, respect and recognition, and voice and agency. So we wanted to know more about the practices that enable, but we also needed to have a look at the barriers to ethical practice. And in lots of ways, they're the inverse of those enablers. Lack of voice, lack of trusting relationships, compliance, organisational compliance, got to have it. Systemic issues, got to have them. Organisational culture, behaviour management. So they came through as being really important. What I just wanted to mention very briefly about this in the work that we did was not just in schools, but we also worked with kids in residential care and in disability services. It was during COVID, so the numbers were low. But what you can see at a quick glance there is where the young people's views were different from the adults. And having issues around voice and autonomy was one of those clear differences. Trusting relationships, another area where there were differences in views of staff and students in relation to how well schools were doing around those practices. So it kind of causes us, I guess, to just pay close attention there. About 990 students involved in schools. I'm not going to go through these with you, but there's lots of examples in the PDF of today's talk that you'll all be able to access of the questions that we asked in the survey about the practices tied to the enablers and the practices that are tied to the barriers to ethical practice in school. What was really particularly interesting, to cut to the chase on this more in the document you'll receive about this. But what was really important, if you look at the blue line across there, they were the outcomes that we were measuring with almost 1,000 students in schools around. These were high schools, particularly. Wellbeing outcomes, feeling safe, getting on with peers and recognition. We put in an outcome measure for getting on with peers because it came up so strongly that there were all sorts of contentions around that. So if you just look really carefully at that, if you look at the blue and the orange areas, these featured in all of those 4 outcomes. So there are some universal practices that we do in schools, like communicating with each other and working together when things go wrong, that really do have a tremendous impact when it comes to influencing wellbeing, safety, including cultural safety. We had a measure on cultural safety, recognition, and getting on with peers. Won't go into these, but the pathway was very, very similar. So if we're working on those practices, it is more likely that young people reported that they felt recognised at school, cared for, respected and valued, and that in turn the pathway led straight back to student wellbeing and safety. And some of these we had sent out independently because some of these pathways just looked too obvious in many respects, but it makes good sense when we change the culture as understood by this is the way that we do things around here, then it doesn't matter whether that's about safety or wellbeing or recognition or participation. We can take from this data that all of those will be positively impacted. So just to pull this together, key take home, and I'm sorry it's been a bit of a quick run, but as I said, there's lots more that's available for those that might be interested in this work. The key take home from this research, like in real estate, we talk about location, location, location. In this world of work in schools, relationships, relationships, relationships. When schools and systems say to me, Anne, that's all nice, but where do we sort of go first? Where do we look at? What do we look at really closely? And I say, how are you going with relationships within your school? Because the rest is otherwise, as I said, built on slightly shaky territory. Levinas talks about his philosopher, as some of you will probably know, but talks about the fact that we cannot become authentically human without them. We cannot become authentically human without them. So it sort of brings us back, I think, to that whole idea about putting a faith perspective on this as well. You know, Pope Francis has been very big on this notion of accompaniment. Some of you here in this big room today know a lot more about that than what I do, but I think it holds tremendous potential for thinking about what he calls that reflecting our compassionate gaze, which also heals, liberates, and encourages growth in Christian life. The little things really are the big things. And we've got a lot of data over a lot of studies that have really brought us back home to that. So really then it's back to the dance floor we go with these questions, thinking about as we proceed now shortly to our panel discussion, thinking about this idea of life and abundance for all based in that beautiful scriptural piece, thinking about what are we already doing well. I think that's such an important place to start because there's so much good stuff that we see out there in schools. What else could we be doing? And importantly, what might we stop doing when we're looking at that dance floor and saying we're not quite sure of the purpose for that other than the fact we've always done it that way. And I think it sort of brings us back to think about that. So the possibilities for schools and school systems, we're going to hear about a couple of those this afternoon. There's another big piece that we did for the Department of Education in New South Wales over a lot of years, and they've included in their strategy document. And when we start to kind of see it coming through, it makes sense. Children and young people are at the centre of our decision making. We won't argue with that. The Alice Springs Declaration, where we started, sets that out. And their goal, every student is known, cared for and valued in our schools. So the more explicit we can be about what we're on about is really important. And just to finish on this note, a tribute to Oscar Romero, I think it's a really important one for us to hold on to, and that it's this. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realising that. It enables us to do something and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it's a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but the difference between the master but that's the difference between the master builder and the worker. We're workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are a prophet of a future, not of our own. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and I too welcome and thank you for joining this national symposium organised by the NCEC. My name is Debra Sayce and I have the incredible privilege of leading Catholic education in Western Australia. Thank you so much, Anne, for your excellent presentation. It was wonderful, and to put children at the centre of our discussion is just so vital and important for all of us. But before we begin and I introduce the panel, just a few comments about the presentation. You commenced with the Mabantwe Education Declaration, highlighting the development of the whole child and placing the child at the centre of the Australian education system. In Catholic Ed WA, our vision is encapsulated by a statement, Christ-centred and child-focused. And our Archbishop, Tim Costello, restated this by saying, well, let's be child-focused in a Christ-centred way, which absolutely underpins all of our work, no doubt, throughout Catholic education. And you also cited John 10:10, which scripturally underscores the flourishing person as Jesus envisaged. In WA, we talk a bit about Maslow before Bloom. This acknowledges the importance of physiological needs to be met, along with safety, belonging, and so on, which are important for optimal learning to occur for that young person. And you have presented this so succinctly in positing that in order for a young person to have the fullness of life as desired by Jesus, you said the model that is in the context of Catholic education, wellbeing, learning, and the spiritual life are three intersecting and integral parts of the flourishing young person. Thank you for presenting us who the young person is today and what are the influencing aspects in their development and their formation. You provided a very comprehensive picture of the young person in the world their interests, their concerns, their beliefs, and very importantly, how we as educators view young people. And your definition of well-being and research and explanation of recognition are very helpful in understanding the young person. And of course, how theory meets practice in the listening to young people and understanding their needs is just so vital. Young people we know are complex, but as Catholic educators, we are very committed to ensuring that they are provided with the best quality education and faith formation experience, thus ensuring, as the Mbantwe Education Declaration states, to be active, confident, creative, successful learners who are active and informed members of society, and as we would want, with a Christian mindset. And just before I introduce and invite our two other panel members, and your presentation always brings to mind that beautiful prayerful reflection by Saint Oscar Romero. It says, as you cited, no program accomplishes the Church's mission. No set of goals and objectives include everything, and this is what we're about. And we plant the seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise, and we lay foundations that will need further development, and we provide yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. So with that, I'd like to say and welcome to our two other panelist members who have joined us today and have worked very closely with Anne and the team at the university. So to start off with, I introduce Ron Whelan, the principal of McCarthy Catholic College in Tamworth. Rod has worked as a school performance leader at Armidale Catholic School's office and as a teacher, assistant principal and principal in the Wagga Wagga Diocese. He is the author of Living Well, Learning Well, a student support framework for the Diocese of Armidale, which integrates learning, wellbeing and behaviour domains with an emphasis on skilled, ethical adult practice, a contemporary understanding of a multi-tiered system of support, and a collective adult responsibility for improving conditions for learning, wellbeing, faith development, and pro-social behaviour. The work of Professor Anne Graham and Dr David Armstrong from RMITU is central to the framework and its goals of ensuring that students feel safe, valued, cared for, and highly regarded as learners in the school system. So welcome, Rod. And our second panelist member is Gary Reen, Assistant Director, Mission at Diocese of Lismore Catholic Schools. Gary holds a master's degree in theology and having spent 30 years in Catholic education as teacher and leader, including being an REC assistant principal and a principal in primary and secondary settings in both schools and large colleges, and I dare say in regional schools as well. Gary has worked as a religious education consultant. He is currently a member of the National Catholic Education Commission's Faith Formation and RE Standing Committee, the Catholic Schools New South Wales Mission Reference Group, and is chair of the New South Wales ACT Heads of RE. Gary has a great interest in change agency and has worked with the Harvard Kennedy School regarding system change. He also volunteers in his spare time in various mission activities, having worked with Mara Solidarity in Cambodia and Adamson University in the Philippines. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for your time. I know that you're both very familiar with Anne's research, and it would be a good start to have a brief overview of how your diocese and school communities are applying the learnings from this research in your local context. So, Rod, if I can start with you, and particularly around the work that you've done in Living Well and Learning Well. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Deb. Hello, everyone. So Living Well, Learning Well is a student support framework, and we think it meaningless to separate learning, wellbeing, faith development, and positive behaviour domains. We take an ecological approach to student support, which means that we recognise and consider the many complex interactions and influences that impact and shape young people. We recognise the students in our school as complex individuals worthy of our highest regard. We suspect that in the past we have slipped into pretending that young people are simpler than they really are, that has shaped assumptions, structures, language and practice in schools, and we do want to challenge that. But our starting point is with adults, and we want people who work with us to have an unconditional, positive, high regard for children and young people. And we want people who work for us to have a high regard for our collective ability to improve the conditions in the setting that we look after, our school, for learning, wellbeing, faith development. So we want our schools to be a protective factor in the lives of the students who attend our schools. And we acknowledge and increasingly aware that the biggest in-school risk factor is a realisation of an unsuccessful or less than successful learning and or wellbeing pathway. And we want to be individuals, teams, schools, and a system that mitigates this risk and certainly does not contribute to that risk. So we focus on meaningful student participation. We focus on instructional coherence, student recognition, and just as much time on avoiding instances of misrecognition. We want a coherent language and practice, particularly around behaviour support. We think that all these things build student connection to school so that more of our young people do feel safe, cared for, valued, highly regarded as learners. That's the work in a nutshell. The beauty of it is it allows us to stop doing many things and to focus on the foundations. And those foundations of making conditions that allow our young people, our complex young people, to feel more connected to the school setting.
Thanks very much, Rod, and really appreciate the last comment. We're taking away things, as Anne suggested, that sort of puts that white noise in front of what we do for young people, and rather than focus on listening to their voice, as our focus on the symposium is. So thank you. And any comments with your work with McCarthy College?
I think, you know, what has struck me very strongly about the approach that's been taken under Rod's leadership across the diocese, really, and not just at his own college, is the fact that if you're looking for change within the system, then making sure that all of those people at the various levels within the system are actually able to kind of engage with the evidence in a very accessible way, and then really be given tools to be able to reflect on it, map it, look at what it looks like in our schools, have the dialogue, have the conversation, because otherwise I think not much changes. And what I think I've really noted about the efforts that have been put in that into that diocese is certainly that Living Well, Learning Well strategy was rolled out across the diocese in a very intentional way to be able to make sure that everyone in the system was able to access it and had the tools. We developed some tools for them to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anne. And again, Rod, your point about working with the adults, working with the staff to provide that consistency and that common language rather than put it on the student and students to do the heavy lifting. I think it's incumbent upon us as adults and certainly as teachers that we do this. So Gary, in Lismore, your diocese has been particularly focused on integrating wellbeing and pastoral care as part of formation and mission. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. Look, Anne's work and research has been so important to us in understanding the mutuality between these domains of mission, Catholic vocation, leadership, and particularly pastoral care to inform our fullness of life framework. All around the country, I know many of you have fullness of life within John 10:10 within many of your documents, but what does accompaniment really mean? Pastorally, what do these things mean in wellbeing for the student at the centre? So are we really smelling of the sheep in 2023, going to the peripheries? Pope Francis said our schools sometimes become field hospitals. Well, we certainly found that out last year in the catastrophic floods which we had. So, Anne, in your presentation, you mentioned Pope Francis' Evangelic Gaudium 169, and we use that extensively, this compassionate gaze of Christ to heal and liberate. It's not a new thing. A Catholic worldview is actually 100 years old this year. It talks about this Christ lens on all we do to permeate the school. So, you know, this has been in our lexicon for a long time. Pope Benedict talked about, you know, how are we going to really get to the peripheries in these times of the lost, lonely, and least. Francis took that further, diaconia. What does that mean now as far as schools are concerned in what Benedict was calling a missionary impulse? So some practicalities. I mentioned the floods before. We've got a wonderful team here led by Karen Evans. One of the key aspects of Anne's research and praxis was around the flood itself, not in the event, but not only in the event, but above and beyond and later, 12 months later. What was the student voice in the choice of how they would remember the 12 months? What is the student voice in how they express trauma? So on the anniversary of our flood disaster, student voice in remembering was so important. Other things that have impacted from Anne's work in our framework include the development of assistant principal mission, someone that has a huge co-responsibility with the pastoral care coordinator with this overarching sensibility of mission. And that person brings that faith element to how we see as Catholic schools wellbeing. Serious funding of counselling and looking at what councils actually do through this lens. So there's been a lot of influence from Anne's work, but perhaps in a charismatic sense, how are we really bringing children to know that Jesus loves them? And I'm looking through that faith lens as we discuss this. So there's some of the things that have helped us in developing a really strong framework.
Thank you very much, Gary. And it strikes me again with what Rod said is about working with the staff, the adults, to really provide that integral approach across the board rather than do it in a siloed way. And be interested in your comments and the work in the Lismore Diocese supporting this whole process.
Oh, it's been a privilege to be involved with the diocese. The openness here, as it has been with Armidale, to really engaging and to looking hard at what is happening. I think what strikes me as really significant in the work in this diocese is this notion of permeation, and I think that's been a really important thing. It's not parts of the system. It's like, and I think we just got that very quick visual that I shot up about that worldview model, but it does come back to saying that at the end of the day, this does link back in with that Catholic worldview and the Christian tradition and the Christian life. So what I've noticed through all of that, particularly around the recognition work, was the reclaiming of the notion of pastoral care. And the fact that that's care and the healing, but look, and giving teachers and schools scope to be able to look at how that really infuses all of the work in the system, including, as Gary says, counselling and all of the other areas that have served the diocese so well.
Thanks, Anne, and a good synthesis of what's happening there, because how you systematize across the different schools and the different contexts of each school, whether it be primary, secondary, composite, is so important that comes through. So if we draw on, I'd like to draw on three particular threads a little bit more, which will be helpful, as we go forward. Firstly, what well-being looks like, particularly the concept of human flourishing. Secondly, how do we move from child-centered approaches to being more child-focused in a Christ-centered way? And then how do we know we're doing okay? What are our measures? So the NCEC's recent publication, and perhaps, Gary, you're a part of this, the Student Faith Formation in Catholic Schools, it highlights the important goal of the Catholic school to ensure its education program is intentionally directed at the growth of students in the fullness of the humanity, intellectually, physically, socially, emotionally, morally, aesthetically, and of course, spirituality. And this aligns beautifully with the Alice Springs Declaration with regards to its desire for all young people. And how does well-being sit alongside the concept of human flourishing? You touched upon that.
Well, I think that the concept of human flourishing, I think it's kind of got its roots in Aristotelian ethics somewhere. You know, it goes back a very long way, and it's all about promoting growth, and it's holistic. So thinking about flourishing in attending certainly to being healthy physically, but that how emotional needs are being met, having high levels of trust, you know, that allow children to function socially and enable them to function socially. I guess that the whole thing about sort of moral choices to make the world a better place, all of that makes up, I think, what flourishing is. But I can't think of a better kind of way to articulate it than this notion about fullness of life, that to be flourishing as a human being is a journey, and it's an inner journey, as well as, you know, we've got to pay attention to our interior life as well as the kind of physical as well. So I think that's really important, turning, you know, towards rather than away from love, I think, is fundamental to whether or not we flourish.
Thank you very much, Anne. To the notion of Maslow before Bloom, which is the concept of tending to the fundamental needs of a young person in terms of safety and belonging, enabling them for optimal learning. Rod, how does your framework support students whose fundamental needs are not being met while also progressing their learning?
Deborah, we use a contemporary understanding of a multi-tiered system of support.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the old days, there were 3 levels in the triangle, and the first tier 1, it was preventative stuff. And we've come to the realization that young people don't turn out to be wonderful adults because we prevent them, in most cases, from becoming otherwise. So now we look upon tier 1 as those conditions that we want for all students, all staff, in all settings, all the time. And they're the settings that promote a feeling of safety and being valued and cared for. We know that students vary in their learning and in their social, emotional development, and in the barriers they may face to achieving successful learning and wellbeing pathways. One of the things that we try really hard to do, and particularly in secondary schools, the world can change in the 5 metres between one setting and another. We don't want students wondering how they're going to deal with the next adult as they walk to that next setting. We want them to think, I hear a coherent language and practice of care, and I see an ethical practice. When we get those calm and safe and eventually autonomy promoting settings, it's much easier to identify and mitigate the risks to those who don't have basic needs met. We would always say, start with a calm and orderly setting with a skilled, helpful adult who believes in their capacity and the capacity of the team to improve the lives of the young people in front of them. That's easier to say than to achieve across a large setting.
And just to extend that a little bit more, Rod, in the term of recognition that Anne explained so well, and you've also articulated that through certainly your work, how then do you cultivate a culture of shared responsibility for each student? Because recognition, as Anne pointed out, is not about rewards, but recognising the person. How do we know that you're being successful in this?
We think now that the most influential leaders in schools are the middle leaders. We would say to our leaders, every time we stand and talk, every time we are in interaction with anyone, we are modelling. And it needs to stop being the work of a leadership team telling us, here's how we do it. It needs to be on the ground. It needs to be demonstrated through our middle leaders. But you find very quickly, when people understand the damage of misrecognition, and we say to them, just don't take the risk. Gee, that's powerful. So don't undermine the good work of others who provide positive recognition by the person. And it's difficult because things can get tough in schools. But we've got some really powerful things like considering the size of your audience and always and assisting a child to replace a behaviour that causes adult concern with the smallest possible audience, for example. Just some little scripts that we hold up here that mean we've been really quite successful in avoiding misrecognition. And we're always saying teachers, we try to not use the term teachers too much, and we talk about our helpful staff, because recognition is provided so wonderfully at administration level, at canteens, by groundsmen, by all sorts of staff across schools. And it's a good, safe place to start. Everyone talks about the importance of relationships in schools, but there's also the trust that I mightn't know that adult, but I've got a fair idea how they're going to treat me. I think that's just as important.
Rod, thank you very much. Gary, you spoke about the importance of diaconia, serving Christ and applying a mission lens to the student wellbeing and pastoral care. So when we talk about human flourishing in the Catholic context, it's about the human flourishing of each person and for the common good. And I go back to our Archbishop in Perth, Tim Costello, who would see this as a child-focused and a Christ-centered way. So Gary, how are you cultivating this through the intentional formation of students in Lismore?
Well, I think it's what Rod's saying around, consistency around a pastoral care approach and what the word pastoral means. In our sense, the Good Shepherd, it comes clearly to mind. The tenderness of Christ, that gaze on the student consistently across staff, on students by staff. And I think the other thing is to recognise, the first recognition is the goodness, beauty and truth of the young person. So in Anne's model, value and voice and choice also really underplay what we mean by that Christ lens. Our bishop would say that I want great citizens as well. So if Pope Benedict's asking for spiritually and physically formed people, I think in this day and age, he'd be adding emotionally and socially formed people as well. So for us, I heard Jacinta talk about, the Christian anthropology of the human person. We're also much interested in who we're sending out into the world, and particularly what meaning they make of the world from their 13 years within a Catholic school.
And their contribution, as I go back to the Alice Springs Declaration, and we'd say, with a Christian mindset, with that civic responsibility, it's really fantastic work there in all of that. So we go back to the title of Anne's talk. Are we listening? What are we doing well? What are we doing well in listening to today's students, and where do we want to focus more? So in some concluding remarks from each of you, what's your thoughts for each of this? So if I can start with you, Rod.
Student voice is a difficult thing because we say it, and behind it there are assumptions as well. So we have to really investigate what we are talking about. Now, we don't expect students to be experts in pedagogy and inclusion and adolescent psychology, but they are experts in knowing how they feel in terms of how safe they are, whether they feel valued, whether they feel included. So we should be asking them about that often. And we have a survey that we use that regularly just focuses on that. And when we do it on a large scale, it allows us to take action based on that. We're really happy to be able to do fewer things. As soon as we get that finding from Anne, that participation has this positive correlation with well-being, we stop the packages. The package is being at school. The package is being here and being in community. And it's more than the quiet listening about how we're going in different settings. Some people's assumption might mean that it's forums and that it's voting. And we think it's just the opposite. One big shift we've noticed is in our student leaders. We've just got one rule for the school. We don't have a discipline policy as such. And the rule is make sure people have a better day because you're with us today. and it applies to the staff and adults, and gee, it's good. But the student leaders' work, they've now become part of that team where they would say their main work is finding a younger child and making sure that they feel good walking into the school today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rod. Gary, your response.
Yeah, look, the very last piece of our framework that we're embedding is around student voice. We've got a definitive approach to that with a group that's working on that. But the student voice that starts in the homeroom, in the playground, everyone in the school knowing who you are, recognising your gifts and talents, seeing you as a becoming, and seeing your spirit. They're the sort of things that Rod's talking about that we want to not only embed but test through our data. We've got another very good data set as well, and that will complete for us this permeation idea of what the Christ lens looks like, not only in the classroom but in the playground and in all aspects of the community.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. And Anne?
That's very interesting. I think the issue of being present to every student is the responsibility of every teacher, and it's what they do day in and day out. And I would say to teachers, when it comes to issues related to their student participation and opportunities to hear their voice, choice, influence, and working together, is to back themselves, for teachers to kind of have a look at what they are currently doing and say, given how much busyness there is on the dance floor, we're doing fairly well. But I think there's a couple of really important parts of that. One is, about, depending what you consult, 94% of our communication. So remember, one of those practices was around how we communicate is actually non-verbal. And so what we wouldn't want teachers to think is feel burdened that there's more to do because they're already doing it. It's the nod. It's the how are you going today? It's the, all those informal interactions. So I think for teachers to be able to have a look at that and see them in a different light in terms of their significance. The other thing I think what I'd say is sometimes we've got to listen to what our students, our children and young people are not saying, as well as what they are, because I think there's something more powerful in that kind of a knowing that there's something going on, but you're safe here, you'll be okay here, we can work with that, you won't be humiliated in any way, shape or form because today you can't attend. And I think, that final idea about thinking, when we ask students, when students come back and every teacher's had it years later and say, I had you in 5th class and you changed my life, and you're looking at it and thinking, really? And what they're talking about is they don't remember what they learned, they remember how they felt. And it's really, that's where that profound sense of being cared about, that's really about, seeing Christ in each other. And I think I think all credit to teachers. It's a gift. It's a challenge, it's a tender responsibility, but there's so many out there doing it in wonderful ways. And I think it's an opportunity this week on Teachers' Day on Friday, International Teachers' Day Friday, just to celebrate that.
Wonderfully said, Anne. And one of the joys I have is I receive school annuals particularly from secondary schools, but sometimes primary. And I always look at the back pages where what young people say of their experience of that time in school. And, it is not the subject area. It's always about the teacher and the retreat and the camp and the experience. And if it is about the subject area, it's because of the love of the passion that teacher has and in the engagement in teaching and learning. So it is about that relationship, isn't it? So I'd like to make some concluding comments now as we wrap up. I do want to thank Anne for a wonderful presentation, and also the generosity of sharing that PowerPoint with us, because this will be made available. But to our two panelists, both Rod and Gary, wonderful work, great educators, huge contribution to Catholic education over the many years, but in your leadership in this really important space of enabling our young people to flourish. When we were planning for this panel discussion, one of the key outcomes we wanted collectively for those of us joining today was to take away something that certainly affirmed your work, but also something that challenged to see how you might stretch more in your teaching, leading, and engagement with young people as you encounter them. Anne reminded us supporting students' wellbeing is not rocket science, although at times it feels like an enormous challenge. And the words from St. Oscar Romero is that we can't do everything, and there is a sense of liberation realizing that. This enables us to do something and to do it well. So I invite each of us to think about one action or one concept that we can take away from today's symposium, and to engage in the conversation with colleagues to ask that question: are we listening? Are we listening to our young people? So on behalf of our symposium attendees, I want to thank wholeheartedly both Professor Anne Graham, Rod Whelan and Gary Reen for a very thoughtful presentation and panel discussion. I also want to thank the NCEC, in particular Jacinta Collins and Annette Laughlin-Smith, for enabling us to come together nationally, and to thank Kelly for her acknowledgement to country and prayer, and to our technical support virtual conference organisers, went without a hitch, Event Frog. So can I ask that you share, if you feel compelled to do so, maybe some virtual claps or smiley faces to our panel members, just to recognise the great work and the effort they've placed. And finally, I want to thank you for attending the symposium today. The recording will be made available for future reference, and certainly Anne's presentation and relevant documents, particularly what they're doing in Lismore and certainly Armidale Diocese. And on behalf of the National Catholic Education Commission, can I wish you all a very happy World Teachers' Day this Friday, and affirm the wonderful work of our educators, support staff and leaders in supporting our young people to flourish and have a life that God intends for each of them. And to always remember, we are not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own. Thank you very much, and everyone have a great evening.